a few more people. We've got a pretty good crowd so far. So let me introduce Ben. You know, we're all here to hear Dr. Ben Gillum, who is a biologist, wildlife biologist. He's based in New Hampshire. His love and devotion of black bears has enabled him to study their habits and interact with them for more than 20 years. He, his wife, and his sister have all fostered bear cubs, orphaned bear cubs into their homes and enabled them to return quite successfully to the wild. He's been focus of a number of news articles, documentaries, including National Geographic's Man Among the Bears, Animal Planet's Papa Bear. He's also the author of a couple of books, Among the Bears, Raising Orphaned Cubs in the Wild, and Out on a Limb, Origins of Intuition and Intelligence. So at this point, I guess we'll just start, and I'll keep admitting people, and Ben, you can take it away. And
okay.
Thank you so much for being here.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. We'll see how this
We're
technology.
not getting any audio here.
You can't hear me?
I can hear you just fine, Ben.
Okay. Just tell me when you're ready.
Oh, you can
Very
start. I'll just
weak.
remind people to please mute yourselves. And I'm just going to have you unmute yourself.
How's that?
That's just fine. So you go ahead whenever you're ready.
All right. I started working with black bears about 30 years ago, and I came at it at rather an unusual angle. I graduated from the University of New Hampshire in 1974 with a bachelor's degree in wildlife and hoped to go on to do the kind of work I'm doing today by going to graduate school. But unfortunately, I'm dyslexic, and my grade scores and test scores were below par, and I failed to get into a graduate school. As a result, I went west to a trade school and learned the art of gunsmithing and employed myself as a custom gunsmith and gun designer over 30 years. I had a leg up on studying wildlife because my dad, Lawrence Kilham, who was a virologist at the Dartmouth Medical School, studied birds as a avocation and wrote the life histories of the woodpeckers of the eastern United States, as well as a book on crows and ravens. So I grew up in a household with lots of wild animals around. When I was 2, my dad went on sabbatical to Africa and brought a half-grown leopard into the house, much to my mother's chagrin. My younger sister, Phoebe, who currently helps me with the bears, was 1 at the time, and my next oldest brother, Josh, was 4. He woke up one night screaming with the leopard on the end of his bed. But needless to say, we all survived and returned from Africa with 2 African horned bears and a Nile crocodile that my dad raised in a basement shower until it was 6 feet long, and the National Zoo came and took it away. Black bears, my interest was in carnivores, and black bears kind of came my way by accident. One day, a conservation officer, Phoebe and I started rehabilitating general wildlife, and there wasn't any rehabilitation of wildlife in most of New England. And one day a conservation officer brought us an 11-month-old black bear cub that he thought had been hit by a car. And it turned out it had not been hit by a car. It had no infectious disease, but it still had the shakes and wobbles, and it couldn't climb or stay on a branch. We were unsure about what it was having, but we kept it until it could no longer fend for itself. And then we had to euthanize it, and we sent its brain out to the wildlife disease lab in Wyoming, where the results came back as lysosomal storage disease. This is the human equivalent of this is Tay-Sachs, and it's caused by inbreeding in the population. This likely occurred at the time in the 1850s when 85% of New England was open agricultural land, and the forest habitat of the black bear was greatly fragmented, and black bear populations were reduced to small island populations where this type of inbreeding might occur. My interest in studying the behavior of bears caught the interest of Forrest Hammond in Vermont. He had 2 orphaned bear cubs as a result of his Stratton Mountain Bear study. And he interviewed me to see if I was interested in taking some cubs he had at the time. And those were the first 2 cubs. I was able to walk them in the forest and all right, now we got to figure out how to run this thing. Anyways, and a couple of years ago, we started the Kilham Bear Center, a nonprofit. We probably should have done it 30 years ago, but it's going to be a vehicle to allow my work to go on into the future and the care of bears for future time. We've been able to build a new bear center and bear pens and outdoor enclosure. Some of the cubs we get are very young, generally from den disruptions. These are logging situations or lot clearing situations where they build big brush piles, the bears get in them, and then they burn them in the wintertime. And then the moms run out and can't be reunited. Is the sound of the video coming through?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. We raise these cubs in forested enclosures. Currently, the one we're using is 8 acres. We've just built an 11-acre enclosure. You'll see in this picture about 12 bears. It gives these cubs a...
Not seeing any visuals.
Oh,
Hey.
no idea what I did. So. All right, we get that. The other type of bears, cubs we get are starving yearlings in the spring or the winter. These bears wake up out of hibernation in years when there's not a good mass crop. There's not many nuts around, and they wake up emaciated. This one should have been a 40-pound bear, but weighed about 15 pounds. It was badly frostbit, and hypothermic and dehydrated when it came in. It took a week of subcutaneous fluid to get it going again to where it would finally eat something. And finally it started feeding. In the spring, we were able to release it weighing over 65 pounds.
Wow.
And its fur all grew back and it looked great. Now the question is, if I press the button to go to the next slide, will I get something? Hey, you get it?
Got
Did
to
you-
go to the next slide.
Okay. Oh, yes, there it is.
All right. This is the barn enclosure. In 2018, we had an extraordinary number of cubs. It was a no food year in New Hampshire and Vermont. No beech nuts, no acorns. And we ended up getting 85 cubs. And in this barn enclosure, which is 24 by 32 by 16 feet high, when my sister was in feeding the cubs, they'd all be up out of sight, but we have remote cameras. And as soon as she left, they'd come down and play. And the interesting thing about black bears, I've studied their behavior, and is that they are able to make friends with strangers. And so if you put almost any other species in this crowded, they wouldn't get along with each other. You couldn't bring chickens from different coops and put them together and not have them pick themselves apart. So the bears have this ability to, they go in scared, and within a week they're wrestling with another bear, and then 2 weeks they're sleeping with another bear. Let's try again. Later that spring, we got in April, we got a 2-pound cub. It was probably his mom was probably a single mom. They often run out of milk and abandon their cubs because the breeding seasons are coming up. And this is the cub going for its first walk when it was about 6 pounds.
We can't see a cub, we can see somebody.
We try.
Right behind
You
him.
can see me right behind me, a tiny cub, about the size of my foot. We like to walk these cubs. They have within them everything they need to learn. They just need the exposure to a complex environment to become bears.
Oh, how cute.
So tiny.
Adorable.
My interest in bears has been in studying their social behavior. This chart you won't be able to read, but you'll see that it's rather complex. And the pictures around the edges are like in the talk that I'm giving now. They show the bears doing what I say they're doing. And what I found is that, you know, bears were thought to be solitary animals. That is, the only interaction they had with their own kind was with their mates, their cubs, and they knew they congregated at concentrated food sources. But beyond that, they knew very little about them. And what I've found is that they're actually extremely interesting animals, very social. They form matrilinear hierarchies. They're reciprocal altruists, like we are. They're the only non-human animal that is. And that means the female bears, well, if in my case, I have a bear named Squirty that I work with that I'll talk more about in a minute, but she controls an oak ridge, and the neighboring female moose controls 26,000 acres of beach. And in a year when there's, and these are unrelated females, and in a year when there's only acorns and no beach, Squirty allows moose and all her female relatives onto her ridge. And in years when there's no acorns and only beech nuts, moose allows Squirty and her female relatives onto her home range. So this is a tit for tat with a time delay. It's something that scientists look for in the great apes but never found. It's something that we do as humans. So if your neighbor invites you over for dinner, you feel obligated to invite them back over for dinner. And we don't do that because we're wonderful, but we do that because that's who we are. That's in our genes. And it's our type of social behavior. So these bears was very exciting to discover a difference. The very first cubs that I walked in the forest were the bottle-fed cubs. And I would take them for long walks in the forest, up to 9 hours at a time, and return them safely to a remote enclosure. I was able to observe their very first reaction to their natural environment. I saw their tongues coming out in an exaggerated fashion, sticking to an object, lifting scent off that object and bringing it back into their mouth to their papilla of their vomeronasal organ, which is a small bump behind their front teeth. Bears, like your cats and dogs at home, have the papilla of the vomeronasal organ, and they use it to identify scent. They also have a nasal epithelium, which is their ability to smell. And so they identify scent with the vomeronasal, and they locate and later learn to identify scent with a nasal epithelium. So these cubs, it was a great opportunity to see very exaggerated behavior around scent, something that other scientists thought was invisible and impossible to study. And if you try to study the same thing with adult bears, their behavior is very subtle and very hard to observe. This is I've worked with several of these females. I followed into adulthood. One of them was a bear named Yoda who lived for 5.5 years and raised one set of cubs. But the main bear that I've worked with is this bear. Her name is Squirty. Squirty came to me as a 3-pound cub. She was 6 or 7 weeks old. I walked her in the forest, and when she became of age, I put a telemetry collar on her and followed her into the forest. I watched her as she became an adult. She shared her home range with daughters and granddaughters and formed and controlled a greater home range. Squirty is now 25 years old and may or may not have cubs in her winter den. She's given me an opportunity to know all of her daughters and granddaughters. So I've been able to see a whole family of bears and how they interact with unrelated bears around them. Squirty controls her family group with a matrilinear hierarchy. This is Squirty, her oldest daughter, SQ2, a younger granddaughter, SNLO, a younger daughter, Brooke, another granddaughter, 2, and the youngest SQ2LO, a subadult. And Squirty on sight will chase all the bears below her in the hierarchy. And it's linear because the number 2 female chases all the bears below her in the hierarchy, and the number 3 does the same, and everybody chases SQ2LO. And the result of this hierarchy is that Squirty has the choice of the best habitat, the best foods, and the best access to mates. And it goes down through the hierarchy. So the lower ranking females will in the future have lower ranking offspring, and the subadult, the benefit to the subadult is that she gets, even though she's chased by everybody, she can stay in the greater home range, but there's a price to it, and the price is that she may not have cubs. Normally, a female bear will give birth to cubs at age 3. Because she's being chased, she might not give birth to cubs till age 4, 5, 6, or even 7 years. The young males, the subadult males that came into the female home ranges were quickly chased out. This is Squirty chasing her grandson. I watched this little guy get chased more than 40 times, not only by his grandmother, by his mother, by his aunts, and any other bear that could get a target on him. By September of his 2nd year, he left the greater home range and joined the population of male bears in the upper valley. This is SQ2 as an adult chasing a male bear out of my study site. It's the job of all females to chase male bears away. The females need the higher quality home ranges to raise their cubs because cubs have short legs and can't travel for food, and the males can. But the males are persistent, and they come back and they're able to get food. They come back over and over and over again, but only to be chased more and more. The large males came into my study area, and I'll take a moment to explain my study area. It's on a piece of property that my wife Debbie and I own. It's about 400 acres. I drive up there every evening from the time the snow leaves in the spring until it returns in the fall. I put out some food and individual piles so I can observe social interactions between bears. I got my PhD at Drexel University in about 2015, and it was on the social behavior of bears. I observed more than 1,500 social interactions between bears. In this picture, Squirty, weighing about 170 pounds, is going after a 300-pound male and asking him to leave. These males tended to hang around because of their size. They could take food from whomever they wanted, but the females only tolerated it for so long. And the fact that the males left indicated there was a degree of female choice in mating. Otherwise, without a repercussion, these large males would stay in the female home ranges and compete with the females. The big surprise in my study was there was a number of unrelated females. I kind of alluded to them earlier. They were all related to this bear, a bear I called Moose. And when I released Squirty and her siblings into the forest, and they were 17 months old, I walked them up. I had a remote enclosure. I walked them up on top of the ridge where I thought they might encounter other bears, and they marked all the way up the hill, and rubbing on trees and urinating and the like. And when I left and went home and they followed me back to the cage, marking again. And the next morning they were on top of the ridge. I went up to see what was going on. And when I got close to the cubs, I had telemetry on them. I turned the gain down, and when I got close enough, I could call them in. On this day, they ran, and the only explanation for them running was that they were with a wild bear. So the next day, I snuck into their feeding area. I had the wind right. I was doing a good job till I stepped on a large stick. My cubs treed and went up a large red maple tree and started an undulating moan. And this bear, Moose, came over and false charged me. She defended my cubs from me. And I represented the most dangerous animal in the forest. And she was willing to take that risk for two cubs that I knew that were not related to her. And ever since that time, Squirty has allowed Moose and all her female relatives access to her home range. And that includes my study site, which Squirty controls the bears that come into there. No bear enters without her approval. And the remarkable thing is Squirty shows more aggression towards her family members than she does towards these unrelated females. And there I saw a huge parallel with human behavior. After all, we're much more aggressive with our family members than we are with strangers. And the reason is that our family members are our closest cooperators, and communicating with them is terribly important. Unfortunately, how we communicate is not always pretty, but we can get away with it because we can always reconcile with a family member. But you wouldn't go up to a stranger and rank them out the same way you might a family member, because you might not be able to reconcile with a stranger, and then they might be critical in your survival sometime in the future. So again, this was something that, sorry about that. This was something that was looked for in the great apes, but never found. And the bears appear to be the only non-human animal that share our social behavior. So there's a possibility that we'll learn if any of this catches on in the scientific community. I'm in the process of writing papers, but that's a long drawn out process, that we may be able to learn something about how we became human in the first place. The male social behavior was harder to follow and understand. The male's annual home range can be as much as 200 square miles. They can easily go from state to state, or in my case, living up here in New Hampshire, they can go up into Quebec, Maine, Vermont, and down into Massachusetts. I first started getting an idea what was going on in the male behavior because in areas when there was a surplus of food, especially in a logging situation, when there was an abundance of berries and ants, bees, and grubs and stumps, an extraordinary amount of bear behavior. And I had set up remote cameras with a small amount of corn in front of them. And as soon as the corn was gone, I'd replace it. And it wasn't unusual to attract 8 or 10 different males.
Kind of remote from one another.
And I did this a lot before I finally understood what was going on, taking several 100,000 pictures. But finally, I had a clear cut that was nearly at the end of its productivity, with 16 years old. I set up my cameras. I got my 8 or 10 different males. And the next year when I set my cameras up, there was the only bear there was the resident females. The males had all moved on to another area of surplus. The big surprise, however, was there was a number of pictures, more than 30, of 2 male bears sharing that small amount of corn. Now, these males are unrelated. They're not brothers. So we've done the DNA. We use hair snares to collect hair samples. We did the DNA, the UNH Genome Lab did the genetic makeups, and we found the male bear population was genetically unrelated. So this isn't reciprocal altruism because they're both benefiting at the same time. This is what's called mutualism, and between strangers. And this is something we as humans do as well. And it's a very advanced social behavior. All this is about the access to food. And in the spring of the year, the bears eat what I call emerging growth. Down in Connecticut, you've got skunk cabbage that they'll be in, but these cubs are climbing a red oak tree, eating the oak leaf starts. When the leaves first emerge, they'll eat the buds of beech, swollen buds of beech when they first emerge from the dens. And by mid-May, they're eating the beech leaf starts, and they'll eat beech leaves as late as the middle of June. The nice thing about these emerging growth in years when there are no leftover nuts, there's very little social competition at this time of year. And the bears pick this time of year for their mating season. The female bears first come into estrus in the middle of May and continue on until the first week of July. The male and female bear spend 3 to 7 days together, and the result of that union is a 2-cell organism called the blastocyst. They're delayed implanters, so the blastocyst doesn't implant into the uterus until late November, early December. And then there's a short gestation period of about 55 days, and the cubs are born in the dead of winter, mid-January, weighing less than a pound. Their eyes are shut, their little ear flaps are down. They continue to develop outside the womb and are not ready to emerge from the den until the snow leaves in April. And then the mother bear will spend the next 4 weeks at the entrance of the den as the cubs learn to follow and climb before she moves on to better feeding grounds. And when she does, she'll go to large pines or hemlocks, babysitting trees that are usually near water. The cubs will spend their time up in the tree. She'll radiate out of the base of the tree to forage and feed. Cubs' toenails are audible on the bark, so if something scares the cubs, the mother can return in a hurry to see what's going on. The family unit breaks up. Anyways, they forage and feed in this fashion through the summer and fall. The winter of the first year is yearlings. They den with their mother. And in the spring, when the breeding season occurs, when the male bear shows up, the family unit breaks up, and it happens rather dramatically and suddenly. It'll go from a very tender scene like this, where Squirty's daughter Josie is removing ticks from her yearling son. And a week later, after the male bear shows up, she becomes the tail of the Hun. This female bear.
You just talk about. I found it. He just talk about.
Please wait a
You
second.
just talk
Oh,
about.
thank you,
you.
Sophie.
This female bear chased her cub up a tree, and then she would descend, go all the way to the bottom of the tree, and every time her cub thought about coming down, she'd run back up the tree. I watched her run up that tree 9 times in 10 minutes. So if you ever wonder how powerful a bear is, just think about going into your backyard and climbing up in the apple tree and see how you feel. These bears are extraordinary animals. Finally, the male bear shows up. This is Squirty's daughter, SQ2, meeting her mate for the first time. You'll see that she's rather aggressive with him. She's been busy with cubs for the last 18 months. She doesn't know this big stranger very well. He's calm and collected. He's been out Don-Juaning around. You'll see him open and closing his mouth. He's expelling moist air from his lungs, picking up her condition of estrus. You also see the size difference between them. All his extra energy goes into growth, hers into reproduction. He pursues her and finally catches up and grabs her with his forepaws and bites her behind the neck. All of this aggression and the bite behind the neck help stimulate the female to ovulate precisely at the time of mating, which ensures that conception will take place. This first grasp only lasted a few minutes before she broke away. There was another 20 minutes of pre-courtship behavior at my study site with some rather dramatic open mouth wrestling and stand-up wrestling. There are pictures in my book, Out on a Limb, that show this at close distance. And finally, he caught up with her again and grabbed her this time. They hooked up, they literally hooked up. They were locked together for more than 45 minutes. And at the same time, there was another female bear at my study site who walked by him 10 feet away, rubbernecking as to what was going on. Finally, they broke up and disappeared into the forest. 85% of the black bear's diet is vegetative. The remaining 10 to 15% is animal protein. And of that animal protein, 90 to 95% is insects, ants, bees, and grubs. Having said that, bears are not true predators. They're opportunistic predators. They will take chickens or livestock or young goats or things like that that are easy to catch. In the wild, they'll take deer fawns or moose calves in the first week of life, but they're not practiced at it. They don't respond to movement or sound like a coyote or a bobcat might. They literally come across something, and if they can catch it, they'll take advantage of it. As I said, bears, 85% of their diet is vegetative. They're omnivores, but they're far more, they eat far less meat than we do as humans. Summer habitat of the black bear, they feed heavily on succulent vegetation and moist-rich soils. Jewelweed or jack-in-the-pulpit or skunk cabbage All these things are high in protein and especially the jack-in-the-pulpit, which has a root or a corm that's more nutritious than either beech nuts or acorns. It's the summer habitat of the black bear that bring people and bears close together, because these all occur in moist-rich soils and in the valleys, and we tended to settle in those areas for the same reasons, for those rich soils. It's not unusual for somebody to have a nicely mowed lawn and leading up to an old orchard with maybe 3 feet of vegetation. Black bear can be out there foraging on jack-in-the-pulpit and you never know it. You never know it unless the black bear stuck its nose up in the air and smelled black oil sunflower seed. Black oil sunflower seed has 6 times the calories of most of their natural foods. And in a year without beech nuts or acorns, it can be more than 10 times the value of vegetative foods. Bears prioritize their foods by the quality of food, the quantity of food, and the amount of risk that it takes to get the food. The average black bear needs to put on 30% of its body weight in fat just to get through the winter. A female black bear that's going to give birth to cubs needs to put on 50% of her body weight in fat to get through the winter, give birth to cubs, and have reserves to nurse the cubs through the early spring. So bears eat to store fat, to survive and reproduce. If you want to understand it better, just think about humans. And how we handle money. We store our money in the bank for our retirement, to put our kids through school or to buy a fancy toy. And you wouldn't go home in the evening and spread $100 bills all over your lawn and have the expectation that nobody would pick any of them up. And that's the same expectation we have when we have food attractants out and wonder why the bears come and take our bird feeders or our garbage. The natural foods that the bears use to put on the fat to get through the winter and reproduce in New England are acorns and beech nuts. Bears use a number of different types of dens. This is a excavated den. Yoda dug it under a root mass of a tree that had gone over many years before. When I crawled into the den and looked up, the ceiling of the den was a matrix of live roots that prevented the soils from collapsing down around her and her cubs during the winter. This bear chose a different strategy. This is an open ground nest. These are usually in dense softwood regeneration or areas of blowdowns. They're usually up against the base of a tree or a down tree. They're a round nest, like a large robin's nest, maybe 3 feet in diameter and nicely rounded on the bottom. Rock dens are frequently used. The rock dens, the entrance of these dens is quite small, not a lot larger than the bear's head. Bears can get into places that we can't even think about. Their shoulders are very supple, their back is very flexible, and they can wiggle down into the rocks into places we can't go. I have a cooperative project with New Hampshire Fish and Game where we try to keep collars on 10 wild females. And sometimes these rock dens, it's impossible. We can see the bear, and we could sedate the bear, but we couldn't get them out of these situations. We've thought about training college students who are skinny, strong, and flexible, that we could lower down into these holes to grab the bears and pull them back out by their bootstraps. But so far that project hasn't gone anywhere. Here's a yearling bear with its mother in a rock den. And then tree dens are the last type of den I'll talk about, while there are others. When trees get to be 3 feet in diameter, they'll form a large cavity where the center of the tree decays and rots out. If there's an entrance, the bears will use these for denning sites. This one was right outside of my hometown of Lyme. A woman called me early in April and said she had a bear in her tree. And I got there and sure enough, there was a bear in her tree. I informed her that the bear had been in her tree all winter long. Bears with a complex social behavior, you'd expect complex communication, and the bears have it. The first cubs that I raised, they would mouth any green vegetation they came across. That is, they'd hold a leaf in their mouth for a few seconds and release it undamaged. I wondered what was going on, so as I said, I called it mouthing. I had Brittany Spaniels at the time. I stuck leaves in their mouths and they weren't very impressed. I put leaves in my own mouth and no bells and whistles went off. So I started identifying all the different types of plants that went into the bear's mouth and documented what ultimately happened to them. And over the course of the summer, the bears identified 125 different food items and rejected many, many more. I determined a bear could tell if a plant were edible or not simply by holding it in its mouth for a few seconds. This gives credence to the fact that Native Americans observed the black bear to find out which plants could be used for foods and pharmaceuticals. So something as simple as an aspirin, which comes from the willow plant, may have had its origin by a Native American watching a black bear feeding on willow. Next, I wanted to know how it worked. And so I got a hold of a roadkill bear. I did some rather crude dissection and I found there was a pocket in the vomer. The vomer is the V-shaped bone that lays under the nasal septum. And in this pocket, there was a large fleshy organ. And as over the years, I did more and more investigation. I found there was a sensory nerve that went down to the roof of the mouth, which explained the mouthing behavior. And there was a bundle of sensory nerves that went up the vomer, under the brain, and spread out over the roof of the throat. So any scent coming in through their nose or mouth crossed this region so they could get a vomeronasal reading on it. And so I found that the bears communicate with scent, and only the true bears have this type of system. The panda does not. And all the other mammals, none of the other mammals that I've looked at the skulls of, it is identifiable in skulls, have it. And the animals that lack it all have long-range vocalizations, and the black bear does not. It only has short-range vocalizations. Bears have emotional expression, which is generally honest. Our emotional expression as humans, we have the most complex facial expressions. We have 3,000 muscles in our face devoted to expression. When we meet in a group, generally we have a neutral look on our face, something I call subway face. We're not giving anything up. But it allows us to meet in a group and be comfortable with the emotional state of everybody around us. If somebody were up to something, we'd know that immediately. We'd know who it was. We wouldn't know what they were up to. A number of years ago, the Boston bombing took place. They identified the suspects by reviewing video and looking for something out of the ordinary. And these two guys were trying to walk casually away while everybody else was terrified. So in this picture, Squirty has just put her yearling up a tree. At family breakup, she has an aggravated look on her face. She has eyebrow expression, general eye expression, general facial expression, and ear expression. When a bear's aggravated, its ears are pinned like a horse or a deer. And in this next picture, Squirty has a happy face. Now, I get told bear stories by lots of people, and I'm often asked, I often ask them what the bear looked like, and the answer I usually get is it was black. Bears have the expression. The bears have the expression of intention. And now, and here I get in a little bit of trouble because most scientists believe that only humans can have intention. But there's a lot of things that most scientists believe only humans can have. In this case, bears will express what they're going to do. And by doing this, they mechanically generate sounds and actions. So they may chomp their teeth, they may huff, swat, or false charge, or make the guttural sound the male bear was in the previous video, that oh, and the meaning of these sounds and actions is based on the context of the situation at the time. So even though they're limited in the number of ways they can communicate, it's greatly broadened in context. So if you're walking on a hiking trail and you came across the female black bear and she scoots her cubs up a tree and she suddenly false charges you, and that is she rushes towards you and swats the ground, expels a big blast of air, your bodily fluids might run a little bit. You're going to take her literally thinking she's going to attack you. But the reality of the situation is that she's afraid that you're going to attack her. And she's trying to delay confrontation long enough for communication to take place. I've been in these situations more than 30 times. I've been false charged and circled. When a female bear circles you, she just wants to know who you are. She wants to smell your scent so she can keep a track of you. I had a number of years ago in Orford, New Hampshire, a female bear and 3 cubs crossed the road in front of me. I'd never seen her before. I stopped my car and went into the woods after her. I found her along a wetland. She had a babysitting tree that she put her cubs up, and she false charged me, and I held my ground. I kept my eyes on her. I talked softly to her. I let her know that I wasn't going to harm her. And within 3 to 5 minutes, she realized I wasn't a threat. And I spent the next 2.5 hours filming her and her cubs. This is, can't go back. This is Squirty. The context of Squirty's false charge is a fairly aggressive false charge. The last film National Geographic did, last documentary National Geographic did on my work, film crew showed up and thought they'd film Squirty for 8 hours. Squirty showed up and thought 35 minutes was more than enough. And that was Squirty asking the film crew to pack their bags and leave in no uncertain terms. She went from a relaxed situation, and her face started to get long, her ears went back, and then she lunged, did her false charge, and then went back into a relaxed situation. But the message was clear, it was time to leave. Now, false charging is just a way of communication. I've worked with bears, as I say, for 30 years. I've been false charged more than 1,000 times, and the intensity is based on the severity of the situation, and sometimes when I've spent time with Squirty, and I'm using her time when I'm in the woods with her, she'd ask me to leave, and sometimes it was just a simple bow. And when her baby cubs were around, it often would be more aggressive like that. This next video is Squirty's granddaughter, Wanda. Wanda likes to false charge. She does it a lot. She has baby cubs up this tree, and you'll see her false charge is nowhere near as aggressive as Squirty's. And then she walks right up to him. Now, this next video I used in my dissertation on communication, when I talked about intention. And this is Wanda again with two young cubs. There's a bear approaching, and she's trying to communicate to these cubs that there's danger approaching and they should either follow her or go up to or up a tree. And the cubs just don't have a clue. They haven't, they're not old enough, and they haven't learned her vocalizations. I found this was something that the mother bears had to teach, and it was based on experience. And so let's go ahead. So she starts to chirp and gulp, which is a sign of nervousness. She knows the other bear is coming. She's alert to it, and the cubs again don't have a clue. She'll gesture to the cubs to follow her. And as she walks away, the intention is that they will follow her, and the cubs don't have a clue. She realizes they're not behind her, but she gets more and more nervous. The intensity of her chirps and gulps increase. They're beginning to have some idea that something's up, but still they don't have a clue. She gestures to them, tries to push them up the tree, tries to demonstrate that something's coming. They still don't have a clue. Gesturing again. Finally, the bear is getting closer. She's getting more and more nervous. Again, trying to push the cubs up a tree. And finally, the other bear comes into sight, and the cubs see it, and up they go, and she reinforces it. As she's chomping, the bear is underneath the tree that the cubs are at. Now, normally, if you have bears around in your yard, you'll notice that if the mother bear communicates to these cubs with those gulps and chirps and body language, so it's syntax, it's a vocalization and walking away. If a female bear wants her cubs to tree, she heads towards the tree gulping, and the cubs will run out ahead of her and up the tree. If she wants them to come out of the tree, she'll sit at the base of the tree looking up, and she'll gulp, and they'll come down. She wants them to go out in a certain direction. She'll walk away in a certain direction, gulping, and they'll fall in line behind her. But as I say, they have to learn that, and they learn it because the world the bears live in is full of real danger, and it doesn't take long, even though they're not born with that knowledge. It doesn't take long for them to understand that mom really does know what she's talking about. And by the end of the summer, they will listen to every sound she makes and act accordingly. In the spring of the year, the bears communicate with these bear trees. The male bears will advertise themselves by going to these trees and rubbing on them. And then they'll rotate their head and bite the tree right here, and that releases fresh sap from the tree, which waffles off and attracts the other bears. The scent they mark the tree with is large molecules of scent that have very little smell. They pick aromatic trees like red pine or telephone poles, and when they break the bark, they are releasing aromatic sap to attract other bears to their mark. Here's a 350-pound male traveling with a female during breeding season. He'll be marking multiple trees and biting them, letting other bears know that she's been taken. More recently, I've been studying another kind of bear, starting in 2008. I went to China, and they were interested in reintroducing captively bred pandas to the wild. I was asked to give a talk very much like this, and the Chinese got very excited about it. I went over with a delegation of US scientists who were talking about the effects of climate change on pandas. And I was the last person to give a talk, and I gave this talk, and they all gave very scientific talks. And when I got done, Hu Rong, who's the director of science and research at the Chengdu Panda Base, came up to me and she said, "We noticed your talk was quite a lot different from the other talks." And she said, "You make us think." And the next day I was at the Department of Forestry giving the talk again. The Department of Forestry controls the wild panda population in the natural reserves. And they got very excited, and 4 years went by before I heard anything, and they invited me back to talk again. They had questions. They were worried about their cubs running off if they tried the methods I developed with black bears. And pandas are worth a lot of money. They rent them to zoos for $1 million a year. And they're worried about the wild pandas coming and attacking the researchers if they tried this. And I took them for a group of 4 of them. We invited them to New Hampshire. A group of 4 came over. We took them for a walk in the woods with some of the bottle-fed cubs of that year. The cubs, only looked for, explore the vegetation. They found a hornet's nest. I took them to a bear tree, and they got all excited and marked and came off and did a funny stiff-legged walk. Hu Rong got very excited. She says they can communicate with wild bears without even meeting them. And then we went up to my study site, and Squirty came out with their cubs, and a number of other wild females came out. No bears attacked the truck. The Chinese got even more excited. They talked all the way back to Drexel, where they were at the Drexel English Learning Center. And the next spring, we had the first pandas for our panda reintroduction project. All this has been documented in Pandas, the motion picture done by IMAX. It's available on Hulu, and we have copies here if anybody wants to get them. You just contact us. They're not on our website yet. And to finish up, I have a quick sequence. It's Houdini's Apple Tree Gymnastics. So hang on. And finally is dismount. Thank you very much.
That was nice.
Well, thank you, Ben. We've got a number of different questions. So let me see if I can go through them and run them off to you. And people can put additional questions in the chat box. Some of them are comments, so I'll probably skip those. But the first question is, how much does Squirty weigh?
Well, Squirty's weight varies. She's normally, well, now that she's gotten older, and last year she didn't have cubs, so she probably was around 200 pounds through the year. When she's bred, she can go up to almost 300 pounds because they put on 50% of their body weight in fat. But I try to keep a radio collar on her, but her neck's so big now that she can take it off at will. And I still put the collar on by bribing her. I don't sedate her to put the collar on.
So is rank in the hierarchy determined only by age?
No, it's in Squirty's case, she was the first female of that line, and she happened to be a very dominant female. She had a sister, and she was more dominant than her sister, and she chased her sister off. And then 1 year, as an example, she had 3 daughters, and it was the dominant daughter that chased off the 2 subordinate daughters. So the dominant family members tend to stay in the area.
When you quote unquote walk a bear, is there a leash? Do they just stay with you?
there's never a leash. When I go for a walk with cubs, they follow me just like they do their mother. And sometimes that leads to long hours in the woods, because if they get spooked or scared, they can be up on the top of a tree for a substantial amount of time. But you just got to plan the day that way.
It's a sort of a more personal question. Does your dyslexia allow you to better pursue this work?
I believe it does, because I followed the evidence, if you will, and if I were a good reader, I would have had preconceived ideas of what bears were and how they behaved and what their behavior was. And I just, I observed things. I was fortunate to have my dad who showed me how to make good observations and keep good field notes. I've got 30 some odd years of field notes. His advice was simple. It was, you write down what you see, not how you interpret it. And when you have enough data collected, the interpretation is going to come out and be evident.
So how do the male cubs survive when they are first on their own? Do other males compete with them or help them?
Well, they can make, because they're of their social behavior, males can make friends with other males. And when the subadults leave or the yearlings leave, they make friends with other yearlings. As an example, my sister raised a single male cub one year and walked it, and she took it out in May for a walk up on the ridge behind the house. And the cub got very excited, communicated to her that he didn't want to come back. And it was pretty evident to her there was another bear around. So eventually she just came home and left him up there. And he was gone for, about 3 to 4 weeks before he came back down to the enclosure. And when he came back, first of all, he had behavior that she hadn't seen before. I mean, he was stand up, head down, communication and greeting. And he came back, even though he was a yearling, he came back with a 2 or 3 year old male that weighed about 150 pounds. And they were playing and wrestling and carrying on. So the advantage is that because they can make, just like in our enclosures, they can make friends with strangers. They can communicate that they want to be friends, and they benefit by being together.
How many cubs does a bear have in its lifetime?
Well, now you're going to make me do math. That wasn't my strong suit.
Wasn't my question.
I think Squirty's probably had 23 or 24, something like that. Some years as many as 3, probably averaging 2. Some years only 1, and a couple of years without any.
When is mating season? Might be helpful to know as a hiker.
Well, mating season, as I said in the talk, is May, middle of May until the first week of July. It's when you see there's times when you'll see large bears around, big males, the 300-pound animals. People show me pictures of them on their cell phones, and I say, well, that was June, and generally I'm right, because otherwise they're not visible. They're not, when the mating season's around, they're out looking for females. But it doesn't make them any more dangerous. They're interested in females. They're not interested in you. The reason I can take the video that I take and stuff is because I'm not there. They're interested in each other.
What bear
Audible
do you consider true?
communication?
Excuse me? What bears
Is
do
there
you
any
consider?
audible communication?
If you want to put a question in the chat box, please put it in the chat box.
I'm gonna do that.
What bears do you consider true bears? Which species? Why not the giant panda?
Well, I guess the giant panda is a true bear as well, but it's the odd man out when it comes to that anatomy. But the bears that have and I coined it the Kilham organ, that have it are the brown bear, which is circumpolar. That's the grizzlies and Kodiak bears and stuff like that. The polar bear, the sloth bear, the sun bear, the Asiatic black bear, and the Andean bear, and the American black bear. And all of them have that organ, but the panda does not. And the panda is the oldest bear, so it represents a bear that's 2 or 3 times older in its lineage than the other bears.
How can you predict it will be a false charge?
I've never been charged. Bears have to have a reason or a motivation for everything they do. They don't just attack people. They have no interest in people. And so they're almost all that communication is a way of showing their intentions. And bears understand it. We're just not very good at it. And that's why I spend quite a lot of time talking about it, because the more we understand how they communicate, the easier it is to understand them. But the only way you're going to get a real charge out of a bear if you've done something awful to that bear. If that bear perceives you as a threat. And that's why my advice is, if you encounter a bear, is to stand, hold your position, keep your eyes on the bear, and talk softly. Let the bear know that you're not a threat, that you're not going to harm it. And the bear will pick up on that right away.
2 related questions. I'll ask them both now. On average, how long does it take for cubs to recognize the parents' vocalizations, cues? And how old are these cubs of Wanda who won't follow her?
Those cubs, that was in May, but by the end of the summer, even by another month, they'll be responding completely to her. I've watched when I've been with Squirty and her young cubs, even in the end of April, the cubs they try to follow both of us, and Squirty wouldn't want them to. She'd turn around, false charge the cubs, and send them back up the tree. So she's educating them. And eventually they listen to her very carefully. But in the bears world, there are real dangers, because there's other bears, there's predators, there's humans, and they have to listen to their mother to survive.
Do the bears you work with remember you for their lifetime?
They do. The hard part is you don't reconnect with them. The ones in my study area that I see on a regular basis, they all remember me. I had Yoda's brother, Houdini, that was in the last pictures. Just as an example, he wore a collar, and he was a male, so he traveled everywhere, and I got calls on where he was in his dispersal. And he was about 45 miles away. And I drove down to the town that he was in to see if people had seen him. If he was, I could talk to anybody if he was a problem or not. Almost all the situations that he'd been in there was garbage involved or birdseed involved. But I stopped, and a friend of mine was building a spec house, and I pulled my truck up and stopped to talk to him. And next thing I know, Houdini comes running out of the woods to greet me. And he smelled me, and I was 45 miles from where he knew me. So my assumption is that they'll remember me for the rest of their lives if there's a reason that we can reconnect.
I don't know if this is referring to cubs or mature bears, but what are their predators?
You're looking at them. People. The cubs, cubs don't like coyotes. So I assume coyotes try to get cubs. The cubs can go up trees fast. And, you know, if there's any threat or smell in the air, they go right to the base of a tree. And if anything approaches, they go up the tree. But, you know, other bears, there have been occasionally cubs will get killed by male bears, but that's usually because the mother has gotten, usually a first-time mom that's inexperienced, and she thinks the male's a friend and lets him get too close to her cubs. And he understands that if he can eliminate a cub, she'll come back into estrus and he might have a chance of mating with her. But that's, even though everybody likes to talk about that, it's not something that happens. It happens very, very rarely. And I've been around Squirty many years, and boy, she doesn't let any male bear get close. Most female bears will, if the males get close to their cubs, they'll just go right after them and drive them right out of the area, very aggressively.
Do cubs ever fall from trees and get hurt?
Yeah, they do. I haven't, well, we have had one in the enclosure that fell and broke a femur, and we ended up having to euthanize it. But my sister watched one fall 80 feet and roll and run right back up the tree without any injury. But I've seen pictures of cubs that have fallen from trees. This is just on the web and stuff, that are got caught in the crotch of a tree branch or something like that. You know, cubs, they go up there and they play hard in the trees. I mean, they spend a lot of time wrestling and doing stuff that any mother would have heart failure to see their kids doing. You know, right up the tippy top of the trees, wrestling in the top of the tree, swaying back and forth. They get good at it, but yeah, there are accidents once in a while.
Have you ever seen any signs of attempted predation on hibernating bears?
Well, I've been to dens where coyotes have set outside of the den. You can see their tracks and where they sat down in the snow. The cubs are audible in the den, so you could see they could get the idea. But then again, the mother bear is quite capable of defending herself from that situation.
Where do bears sleep at night?
Generally, the bear beds are either at a base of a tree, so they can have an escape route by going up a tree, or at the top of a ledge where there's good thermals that can alert them to other bears or danger that's around. Bear beds, you know, in the hot summer can be on a sphagnum, in a sphagnum swamp where they can stay cool. So a number of places, but they tend to sleep, they're crepuscular, so they're active at dawn and dusk, unless it's a situation where it's high risk, and then they're more nocturnal.
Do you favor bear hunting for, they use the term herd thinning?
I don't get involved with any, well, I put that in the category of politics about bears, and I don't make any judgments. I observe and educate, and I can't educate if I take sides in situations. It's a fact of life I knew about when I started raising cubs. I don't like it when I lose cubs to hunting, but it's the way it is. People are more than welcome to their own opinions and to do what they need to do. But I have, when my first book came out, I got lots of letters from hunters who said if I had read this book, I never would have hunted a bear. So I can't do that kind of education if I'm taking sides and polarizing people.
How long do bears hibernate, and what exactly does this mean?
Well, of course, everybody today likes to have their words, and I use hibernate because even though it's not technically what they do, because it's generally what they do. But bears, the bred females go into the den first, generally by the 1st of November, and they stay in the longest, followed by the females with cubs and the males last. There's an abundance of food that's accessible. The males may be out most of the winter. But the bred females always go to den because it's part of giving birth and being ready for that. And of course, the amount of snow cover there is, the snowpack, where you are, the further north you go, the longer the bears spend in the dens. There's areas up there, they may only be active for 3 or 4 months, and the rest of the time they're in dens up by the Arctic Circle.
What's the greatest difference between black and brown bears, not including grizzlies?
Well, brown bear is a grizzly.
I didn't ask the question.
All right, well, the difference is, the grizzly bear includes the Kodiak bear and the European brown bear, and they're all the same species. The Gobi bear, they're all brown bears. They all have humps on their shoulders. They have big claws for digging out squirrels and roots. They're animals of the open ground. So they're likely to be more aggressive because they can't hide or climb trees to get away from enemies. Black bears are, because of their black as a background coloration, they can step behind a bush and disappear. They're kind of like, suddenly gone. And they can climb trees to get away from danger. So they're certainly less aggressive. It's usually the female black bear. As far as human deaths go, 85% of the human deaths by black bears are caused by large males. And as far as human deaths goes, 85% of the deaths by grizzly bears is caused by females with cubs. That's because they can't hide. Their best defense is aggression, running towards you, charging you. And that's why bear spray works so well with grizzly bears, because if they're running hard, they're breathing hard, that gets into their lungs and stops it.
So I think this is a question a lot of people might ask, with mentioning that, in certain areas, bears are breaking windows, ripping open screen doors. What can we do to keep bears out of our garages, goldfish ponds, etc.?
Well, they're not going to be in the goldfish ponds, but stop feeding them. No food, no bears. Don't have bird feeders. Secure your garbage. Don't put it in open sheds where the bears can smell it. You control bears by controlling smell. If your garbage is stored in the basement or somewhere the smell can't get out, like your house is pretty well sealed versus a shed out back, they're not going to come into your house because they can't smell the food. But if it's an open shed in the back, they're going to break into the shed and get the garbage. But bringing bears near your house with bird feeders is, you're inviting bears to do things that you might not like. And bears will educate you very quickly by doing things you don't like. So it's a matter of just learning how to live with bears.
If a person is walking a dog, is a bear likely to charge the dog? What should the human do in that circumstance?
Well, if you're walking a dog and you're walking it on a leash, you're not going to have any problem. If your dog is unleashed and out of control and you can't, it's not under verbal control and it attacks the bear, the bear turns and attacks the dog and the dog returns to you, there's probably going to be a bear behind it. So my advice is, if you know there are bears around and fresh sign and your dog's aggressive, keep it on a leash.
do a couple more questions, then I think we will end. What is the survival rate of cubs in the wild?
We're working on that now. We've released over 300 cubs at this point, and we put ear tags in them, so that tells us when they die, unfortunately. But I was surprised when my wife put the list together that only about 25% have come back in the hunting kill. And in talking to Andy Timmons, our wildlife biologist, we think that because young animals are more likely to be killed by hunters than older animals, including with white-tailed deer, or get hit by cars, or young and dumb causes mortalities. Every year they live, the longer they're going to live. And so right now it looks like the mortality of the bears we released is about the same as that of the wild bears. In the states where they're hunted, I know Connecticut, there's no hunting season at the moment. But in New Hampshire, probably 15 to 20% of the population is taken by hunters every year. But the population is robust, it's gaining, and largely because of the amount of human foods that enter the landscape, the amount of garbage, the landfills, the amount of birdseed, the agricultural crops, corn and sunflower and the like. So, and even in New Hampshire where there's a bait season, they're hauling tons of bait into the woods right at the time when the females have to fatten up to reproduce. So if you were trying to control population, you wouldn't do it that way. So we're partially responsible for increases in bear populations because the productivity of the bears increases with good food supply.
Do bears get tick-borne diseases like Lyme?
We don't have a lot of, I haven't seen any studies that suggested that they do. They certainly get bit by lots of ticks, mostly American dog tick in my study area, but I've never seen, even though the deer tick is around, I've never seen any lameness or things I would attribute to Lyme disease. And I know they've done blood titers on them, and I haven't heard of much evidence of that.
I don't know if this question's within your expertise, but interesting. When I was first in the Canadian Rockies in 1970, the parks warned women if they were menstruating, they should stay inside as that would attract bears to them. Old wives' tale?
Well, yeah, they used to say that, but then they disproved it. And, women get beat upon in lots of ways. It's a good way to keep them out of the woods, I guess. But, there was a time when they couldn't play sports like men could, and all that's been disproven, and that was disproven as well.
All right, I'm going to do one last question. When you hear the rare story of a bear hurting a human, if the human didn't deserve it, do you think the bears might be rabid?
Well, rabies in bears is extremely rare. I have heard of some cases. They have to get bit by a rabid fox or a rabid coon or something like that. And then, a rabid animal doesn't live very long, and the bear populations are not close to human populations. They're not gregarious, so it doesn't spread in the population like it does in raccoons. So I wouldn't concern myself too much about rabid bear. I've only heard of 2 or maybe 3 cases of rabies in bears.
Well, Ben, I don't know if you've looked at the chat box, but numerous thank yous for the presentation for your work and so forth. And I think we can end it there. And I thank you on behalf of the library and all the land trusts that co-sponsored your talk. And really, really appreciate the talk and what you do.
Well, I appreciate that. This technology is, I'm still learning. So
Oh, once you got it, you were great.
yeah, once we found all the screens, and I did one, tried to do one earlier this year, and everything went south. The computer hookup didn't work and lost the signal, but this one worked pretty good. So.
Well, good. It was great. The pictures are great. It was wonderful.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you.
It was
Thank you.
wonderful. Thank you.
It was
Enjoyed it so
excellent.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Glad you got the video fixed.
I did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very interesting.
Thank you. I'm still not gonna stand still when a bear comes at me.
That concerns me.
I find that very hard to do.
Can you hear my voice?
Yeah.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
You
Take
got it.
care, everybody.
Thank you, Ben.
Great job again.
Thank you.
Okay.
Huh?
Oh, look at the picture. We know why Eric bears.
Huh?
Not any bears.
Bear or dog?
Because bears do not like coyotes.